Hey guys, so we are going to start the Constitution today. So again, this is the law of the land. I mean, basically everything we talk about in government goes back to the Constitution, whether we're dealing with things at the federal level, the state level, or even at the local level. So let's go ahead and get started here. And what I'm going to do, I've got a couple of videos here that I'm going to show you, but there's going to be a couple of them that I'm just going to skip through. So, if you see that, that's why. All right, so our Constitution. First of all, it was written in 1787. It has been effective since 1789. It is the supreme law of the land. It's just over 7,000 words. It can be read in half an hour, and it is divided into 7 sections called articles. So we will talk more about those articles and get into more detail about those. The introduction is called the preamble. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, and we'll go on from there. Right here is where you will find the Constitution in Washington, D.C. at the National Archives. So, some basic facts. Well, again, I'm going to reiterate this and go over this again. I know you already saw this before, but again, it's very important. Again, written in 1787, 1789, it is the supreme law of the land. James Madison is the father of the Constitution, and we talked about that before in the last chapter, or the last unit, and you learned that with Mrs. Matlock because he wrote most of the Constitution. George Washington was the president of the convention. Washington never really debated a whole lot. Basically, it was just there because he was so well respected, and basically he was just the man. He was the Chuck Norris of the day. So people really wanted to be a part of it because George Washington was a part of it. Again, it's divided into 7 sections called articles, and there are 27 amendments. We're going to talk about later on just how cumbersome the process is to get a constitutional amendment passed. Even though our country is well more than 230 years old, there are only 27 amendments to the Constitution. And the first 10 are the Bill of Rights, which begin with "We the people of the United States." And again, I kind of mentioned that before with the preamble. Some basic history on this. Virginia's influence. Well, first of all, the Virginia Declaration of Rights was written by a guy named George Mason. It reiterated the notion that basic human rights should not be violated by the government. Now, even though we see protesting and things going on in this country, if you're arrested, there's something called due process. You have to be told of what crime you're being committed. You have to be able to have the possibility to post bail unless you've just done something crazy where they don't have bail for you. But you will get your day in court. You have a right to an attorney. Even if you can't afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. So you have basic rights. Whereas in some parts of this world, you can be arrested and thrown into a hole, and you can be held as long as the government feels obligated to keep you there. So this was the basis for the Bill of Rights, was the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And again, when James Madison wrote the Bill of Rights, he studied this. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom was written by Thomas Jefferson. This states that all people should be able to be free to worship as they please. And this was the first time that religious freedom was protected by law. So this was put in basically because if you remember going back to United States history, the Puritans came here for religious freedom. But if you did not share their Puritan religious beliefs, then you were persecuted. So this is the idea that you cannot be persecuted just because you don't belong to a certain religious group. You are free to worship whoever you please. But what this will also do is this will also be the basis for the First Amendment, which has 2 clauses. It has the Establishment Clause and it has the Free Exercise Clause. The Free Exercise Clause right here says you're guaranteed religious freedom of whatever you want to believe. But there's also the Establishment Clause, which means that you do not, or you're not forced to be a member of a certain religion. For example, in the United States, even though we're a predominantly Christian nation, we do not have an official religion because of the First Amendment, because there is no established, which we get to right here. It outlawed the established church. You cannot have a favorite church. The Constitution contains 6 basic principles.
The United States Constitution is the backbone of our government, and it is built around 6 basic principles. The first words of the Constitution are "we the people." These words describe the first principle, popular sovereignty. This means that the government's power is given to it by the people. The next principle is limited government. Similar to popular sovereignty, limited government means that no government is all-powerful, and it may only perform duties that the people have given it to do. In other words, no one and no government is above the law. Another word for this is constitutionalism. The U.S. government is divided into 3 branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial. This is the principle of separation of powers. Each branch has its own functions, and those functions are reserved for that branch alone. In essence, the legislative branch writes the law, the executive branch enforces the law, and the judicial branch interprets the law. Each of these branches can be checked by one another to be sure that no branch becomes too powerful. This is the principle of checks and balances. For example, the president, or chief executive, may reject or veto any bill written by the legislative branch. Likewise, the judicial branch can determine that a law passed by the legislative and the executive is unconstitutional. This process is known as judicial review. The 6th and final principle is federalism. Federalism means that power is divided between the central government and the state governments. All power that is not granted to the central or federal government is left to the states. It has been over 200 years since the Constitution was signed, but we still hold its values very true. I hope that now you have a better understanding of the basic principles of the United States Constitution.
Okay, so the first one is popular sovereignty. And again, popular sovereignty means that the people rule, or the people have the authority to rule. So all political power resides in the people. Also, again, going back to U.S. history, if you remember during the issue of slavery right before the Civil War, the Kansas and Nebraska Act talked about popular sovereignty. It's the idea that if people want slavery in an area, then they would have an election to vote to see if they wanted to do that. Let the people choose. That's what popular sovereignty is, that the people have the authority to rule themselves. And when you see this, and see this on a test, you're going to see some of these cartoons. Well, look right here at this cartoon. You see this little car right here. This is the government, okay? And you've got all these different people who says, turn, change direction, higher, slower, watch out, high gear, downshift. So the car is going in a lot of different directions because you've got so many different people with so many different perspectives on how the government should be ran. So the first one is popular sovereignty. The second one is limited government. No government is all-powerful. It may only do those things that the people have given it the power to do. Now, when we get into certain articles, we're going to talk about something called Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, which is called the Necessary and Proper Clause. It's also known as the Elastic Clause because it can stretch to cover so many different things. Because think about this, where in the Constitution does it say give a free and public education to people? Well, it doesn't. That's a 10th Amendment issue, which is a state issue, but yet the federal government is involved because of the Necessary and Proper Clause. Barack Obama hinged his entire presidency on something called the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. Where in the Constitution does it say you give free health care to people? It doesn't. So that kind of goes against the whole idea of limited government. I'm not saying one's right and one's wrong. That is a lot of the pullback that we're getting today. But it's the idea that we need a limited government, a smaller government. Government that does less is government that governs best. And so if you look right here, it says, sure, he's big, but we hold the leash. So this big old dog here is the government. We, the people, hold the dog. Well, guess what? If that dog gets too big, you remember that little cartoon we watched about Barack Obama and Ronald Reagan? Remember what Ronald Reagan said? He's a conservative, so he believes in small, limited government. And he said a government that's big enough to give you everything you want is a government that's big enough to take away everything you have. So if that dog gets too big and he runs away, hey, guess what? we may be in some problems. Separation of powers. This is the division of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Don't get that confused with checks and balances we're getting ready to talk about. This is the idea that we have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. They're all separate, they're all co-equal, and they do their own thing. So the legislative branch makes the law. The judicial branch judges the law. The executive carries it out and enforces it. So look at this picture right here. You see this power bake-off. So the legislative branch, they are the ones that they are making and putting all the ingredients together. You know, they're the ones that make the laws. And then the executive, they're putting it together and they're cooking it and carrying it out to make sure, you know, it's going to be good. And then the judicial branch, they're the ones that taste that to see, hey, does this taste very good, or hey, is it not very good?
How to understand the three branches of government. To make sure that no ruling body has absolute power, the Constitution splits government into three branches. Understand both their independent duties as well as their interactions. You will need the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, and checks and balances. Step 1. Become familiar with the legislative branch. Congress is split into the Senate and House of Representatives. These two bodies are responsible for writing and passing bills. Every state has 2 senators, while the number of members per state in the House of Representatives is based on state population. Step 2. Recognize the powers of the executive branch, which includes the president, vice president, and cabinet. In addition to having veto power on laws passed by Congress, the president is head of the military and responsible for making treaties with foreign countries. However, all treaties and declarations of war must be approved by Congress. Step 3. Review the function of the judicial branch, America's federal court system. The Supreme Court is in charge of establishing lower federal courts and settling disputes over the application of federal laws to make sure all laws are constitutional. The 9 justices of the Supreme Court are appointed by the President but must be approved by Congress. All Supreme Court justices serve on the court for life unless they resign, retire, or are removed by Congress. Step 4. Recognize how the branches interact with and depend on each other. Each branch can check the power of the other branches so that power is distributed evenly, a system known as checks and balances. The separation of power as well as the system of checks and balances is what makes our country run smoothly. Did you know? Congress has denied the president's request to declare war only twice, once in 1815 and once in 1999.
Checks and balances. Each branch is subject to the restraints by the other 2. So this is the idea that each branch checks the other. So, and we're going to do a little chart on that later on. But it's the idea that with checks and balances, it's the idea that one branch is not too powerful. So for example, if Congress makes a law, guess what? It doesn't automatically become law. It's got to go to the desk of the president, and the president can check, the executive can check the legislative by saying, you know what, I'm going to veto that law. Or, you know, I don't agree with that. Or what you could have happen is the legislative branch makes a law, and then they take it to the president, and he signs it. But you know what? The judicial branch might say, that's an unfair law. We're going to strike that down, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment with judicial review. So you can see here the cartoon when George W. Bush was president, and he is holding up this veto, and they're jousting with Congress, and he's got the minimum wage. So it's the idea that, you know, if they want, Congress, if they can have their way, they're just going to push forward that minimum wage. But here is the executive branch checking the legislative branch by saying, you know what, we don't want to raise the minimum wage. And again, you can see here, each branch checks the other. Judicial review. This is the power to determine the constitutionality of government. So basically what happens is the judicial branch, you know, they judge or they interpret the laws to make sure they're fair. And sometimes I think you can look at that almost like a referee. You know, one of the things that's very controversial is flag burning. So I'm going to ask you right now, is it legal to burn the American flag or not? Well, I can tell you it is, okay? It is symbolic speech. And if you don't know what symbolic speech is, cut somebody off in traffic and they give you a one-finger salute. That's an example of symbolic speech, okay? So it's the idea, you know, we don't like it. You know, one thing we have to understand when we get into the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment protects even unpopular speech. You know, you can be a racist. You can be a sexist. That doesn't make it right. but it does make it legal, okay? And there are consequences from that, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. But if you look right here, it says here, what do you mean out of bounds? The best way I can explain judicial review is instant replay in football. So what happens is when a play happens, let's say in football, the referee calls a touchdown. Well, the other coach can challenge that and say, you know what, I don't know if the guy had one or both feet in bounds to determine whether it's, college or professional, or did they have control of the ball.
Rodgers. Says catch. Has to read for Aaron Rodgers.
Ruling on the field stands.
Now again, that determines, beauty's in the eye of the beholder there. Is that a catch? Is it not? That's one of the things about the United States Supreme Court. For example, one federal judge on the Supreme Court, one Supreme Court justice might look at abortion and say, you know what? Abortion should be illegal because it's a violation of the 14th Amendment due process clause. You can't deny life, liberty, and property without due process of law. And guess what? Abortion's murder. But another judge might say, you know what? The same amendment, 14th Amendment, you can't deny life, liberty, or property. Well, guess what? You cannot tell a woman what she can and can't do with her body. That's her liberty. So how do you look at it? Was that a catch? Was it not? I thought he had it pinned against the ground, but you know what? They considered it a catch. That's the great thing about our government. It just depends on, that's why it's so important who we elect as president of the United States, because the president is the one who appoints all federal judges and all Supreme Court judges. And then finally, federalism. This is the division of power among the central governments and several regional governments. That's why we have the Virginia SOLs, but if you go to Tennessee, they don't have SOLs. Now, they have other standardized tests called the TCAP. Right now, again, look at this. In eastern Tennessee, northeast Tennessee, a lot of schools are going back. They're having high school football in Tennessee. They're not in Virginia. You know why? Because we have different governors who make different decisions. That's why in some states you can get a driver's license at 14 years old. In some states you get a driver's license, like in Virginia, which is 16 in 3 months. So federalism is a division of power between a central government and several state governments. And so if you look at our little cartoon here, here's Uncle Sam, the symbol of America, who's nailing up and putting up the American flag. But look at the different rooms in the house. You've got Alaska, you've got Maine, you've got Minnesota, you've got California. Another thing, think about all this unrest that's going on. Eventually, the President of the United States can call in federal troops. He did that, for example, in Little Rock, Arkansas, when they forced the desegregation of Little Rock High School. But you see what's happening with these Antifa and these Black Lives Matters protests that are getting out of hand, and these riots, and they're burning cities. One of the reasons why the president has not done that is because he believes in the Constitution, he believes in federalism, and he's given the police power, which again belongs to the states. Think about that. We have Damascus Town Police, we have Washington County Sheriff's Department, we have Virginia State Police. We do not have a United States police force. We've got a military, but that's completely different. So again, right now, federalism has been kind of tough to teach people sometimes, but right now, in the days that we're in, with all that's going on in the news, federalism should be a little bit easier to learn, I would hope. And then again, you can just look right here. You can see popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial review, and federalism. And that will finish up lesson 1 today.